Okay. Just one moment. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening. Okay. Share content. Just one moment. Yeah, we're gonna go to. Oh, just one moment. Just gotta do something here. Okay, that's why. Okay, back here and this one minute.
Please put this on me.
Hello, Sylvia.
Yeah, hi. Rabbi, can we dedicate the class to Refuah Shaloma for my daughter?
Certainly.
Bonnie.
What's her name and her mother's name?
I'm her mother. Her
Yeah,
name
okay, but I
is,
don't know your Hebrew name.
right, my Hebrew name is Sarah Rivka,
Sarifka, and her name?
and her name is Basia Yisraela.
Basi Yisrael Basar Rivka. So we will dedicate our study for Shalema to her, certainly. And
Thank you.
let me,
So,
and I'm now going to just open up to where we are and post it on the screen. Okay, and we're in chapter. Yeah, okay. Okay, so we are up to your bet, and I'm gonna just make a copy. Okay. Copy it. Copy, and I'll paste it, and hopefully it will work for us. Okay, share content, URL, paste, share. Okay, can everyone see?
yes.
Excellent. Okay, so we are up to Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12 in chapter 5.
$12.
Yeah. Yeshra Chola. Okay. Now, he's going to continue discussing, again, according to the simple meaning, the dangers or shall we say, the insecurity, even of being wealthy. That a person who's always pursuing wealth, and that's their entire purpose in life, may discover they don't even have that. Okay.
What does it mean? They're kept by the owner to his hurt. What does that mean?
Okay, that's why we're going to study it. Okay.
It's an awkward sentence.
Well, yes. and some of that has to do with the nature of the translation. But
I guess I
what it says,
understand. Like it's like it was.
so I'm going to read it.
Okay.
I'm going to read it as the original Hebrew would read. Okay. Yesh ra'achola re'iti tachat hashamash. There is, yesh means there is, it means sometimes it happens. Ra'achola, a bad illness. So in Kohelet, a bad illness means to say something there's no easy cure for. And again, Tachat Hashemesh, we've explained, it means the world that we live in. So Osher Shamar Levalav Lerato. Sometimes Osher Shamar, that there is, so Osher Shamar, the translation is riches kept by the owner. In other words, someone made great efforts to guard their wealth. Lerato, it is to his own trouble. In other words, sometimes a person can make great effort to preserve their wealth. So but in the end, it's to the person's own negative. In other words, sometimes someone will guard wealth and preserve it, and that will be to his detriment, to the wealthy person's detriment.
You can tell that to Jeff Bezos and company.
Well, it hasn't happened yet to them, but it's happened to others. And what does this mean? Well, why? Because you devoted your life to that wealth. Then all of a sudden that wealth is lost. The Inyan Ra, in some negative way, for some bad thing happens. So, for example, the example given here is robbers, or the government takes everything away. V'holid ben, and you gave birth to a son. The ain biyadamuma, and the son has nothing. In other words, first of all, it's possible wealth is fungible; it goes away, and it's entirely possible that someone. So, in other words, if your purpose in life is other things, so if you don't have money to leave your kid, you can leave a good example, you can leave your righteousness, you can leave your good deeds, and so on, right? But if your entire purpose and striving in life is money, and that's what you tell your kids, this is what I'm leaving for you, and this is what you're going to have, you can have my money. Then all of a sudden, I don't know, you run afoul of the government, and the IRS seizes everything, or you live in Russia and you're a billionaire and Putin decides he wants all your money, as has happened many times, or there's a lot of ways that someone could lose everything they have. So if your whole purpose is wealth and you lose that, you don't have anything. Whereas if your purpose are things that are less fungible, then you have something to leave. There are many things, wisdom, good deeds, and so on, that no one can take away from you. So this is one possibility, and therefore, what happens? Kasher yotza mi betan imo, and therefore, just as you came out of your mother's womb, aram yashu lachas k'shabah, you're going to go back without anything. She should take nothing for his labor. Sheyolech biyodeh, that'll take away in his hand. So this is number one. In other words, if your entire purpose is wealth and you have nothing, so you leave with it. If your purpose is wisdom, is Torah, is good deeds, and so on, so that even if you have reverses in your fortune, you still have something to leave to your children and something to leave this world with. Because, and more than that, on a deeper level, as there is a Yiddish saying and a country song that say the same thing. The country song says that I never saw a hearse with a luggage rack. And in Yiddish, we say the tachrichim, the Habanishkin Keshenis, the Tachrichim, which are the shrouds, have no pockets to them. In other words, you can't take it with you, as they say. So that's the other thing. If your entire purpose is wealth, you're still going to go back out of this world as naked as you came in, as a baby. There's nothing that you can take with you. Okay, so that is the simple meaning of these three verses. Furthermore, and then we'll go back over the Mefarshim, over the commentaries, but just furthermore, and we see on the other, and this is also, now there's a second kind of evil that comes with devoting your life to possessions to the exclusion of everything else. Kol umas sheba ken yelech, uma yisron lo sheyamo l'ruach. Why should you labor for the whim? In other words, as you came, so shall you go. In other words, even if they don't take your money away from you, you still won't take it with you, which is the point we made. Gam kol yomav b'choshech yochal, v'kas harbe v'chel yokotza. And not only that, someone who's truly devoted to money, his whole life, he's in a state of darkness and aggravation because you're scared someone's going to take your money away. Sometimes we find that people who are very wealthy don't necessarily share it and don't necessarily enjoy it. They become obsessed with the wealth for its own purpose, and they live like misers and so on. It can make you a little bit crazy, we know stories of various very wealthy people who lived miserable lives because they're worried someone was going to take their money. And in other words, we're not saying wealth is a bad thing. We're saying the obsession with wealth is a bad thing. Whereas someone who has much less but doesn't drive themselves crazy and doesn't define their worth by how much they make and how much they have, is they're going to have a much more balanced life. Now that is the plain meaning. That is the simple meaning of these texts. Now let's take a look at this a little bit deeper. So we're going to take a look at Rashi. So, for example, Rashi says that if your wealth makes you arrogant, and that arrogance leads you to destruction, like Korach, who was very wealthy, and therefore sought to supplant Moshe and Aaron, and went down to the Nevertheless Beth. Now, now, if you look at verse 14, he shall take nothing for his labor. So Rashi says that what this means is that you don't take the merit of charity. If you were wealthy and gave lots of charity, so you take them, all the good you did, all the poor people you helped, all the institutions you supported, that's enormous merit. You take that with you. But if your only concern is your own enjoyment and your own wealth and power, so then you don't take anything with you, because the only thing you take with you are good deeds. Now, let's take a look now at the Seforno. Seforno actually is very similar to the plain meaning. Let's see what the Ibn Ezra has to say. Okay. So both the Sforno and the Mitsudas make the argument that when someone is very wealthy and powerful, sometimes this encourages those even more powerful to take them down a notch and to take everything they have, as has happened throughout history. So if you're very arrogant about your wealth, maybe someone even more powerful who is likely to want to who's likely to want to take it all away from you. Whereas even if you lose everything, your good deeds that no one can take away from you. The good that you did, no one can take away from you. Okay, let's move on to verse 17. Hine asher isione tov asher yafalechu lishtos v'liros tov b'chol amolo. It is better that a person eat and drink, not be a miser, and see good in his work, that he worked under the sun, the days of his life that Hashem gave, and this is his portion. In other words, the person doesn't eat themselves up, but what they don't have. They don't squirrel away to the extent that it affects them and their family. To have a few dollars more in the bank. They trust in Hashem. You work hard and your ambitions are in other places other than one's wealth. And what God gives you, you enjoy properly. Because a person doesn't live a long time, and the only thing you can do is to live like a mensch and squirrel away some good deeds. And that's what you should squirrel away. And Gamza kol adam asher kim nasan kim osher nechasim b'shlita lechol mimenu. Even if you have wealth, God says, look, I've given you the power to eat from it and to carry a portion, which means to carry the portion of your responsibility to society, to others. Because if Hashem gives you wealth, it means that God isn't just thinking that you should stuff your face, but God is saying, look, I'm giving you, you have the ability to share with others, and I expect you to bear your portion to help those who have less, and to rejoice in his toil because you do good deeds with it. This is the gift of Hashem. So to take his portion actually is not a good translation. L'seitas kalko means to carry his portion, which means to take responsibility to share that once you have surplus, to share that with others. Kilo harbe yizkor shimei chayav. Remember that the days of your life are not long. I mean, even if a person lives 120 years, 150 years, it's still a snap in eternity. And life goes by quickly. For God answers him in the joy of his heart, which means, what does this mean? God answers him. In other words, that if a person lives with joy, which means in this case, the joy of the good deeds that we do, so that is God's response, which means to say that God says, hey, I gave you stuff. What did you do with it? If a person has wealth and possessions, Hashem says, I gave it to you to do good with, to bear your burden, to help others, to support whatever needs supporting. So such a person, life is short, no matter how long you live in comparison to eternity, to the life of the world and so on, right? You go to the Western Wall. Some of those stones have been there for thousands of years. How many lives went past and the stones haven't moved or changed very much? Life is short, as anyone will tell you. Therefore, this is the response. So the best thing is to enjoy what you have, but to enjoy it in a way that you bear your burden and share with others. Then you leave this world, you've responded to God. God trusted you with stuff and you used it the right way. You leave this world with something, unlike the person who's selfish who leaves with nothing. What do you leave with? Your good deeds, your good name, and the merit of all the good that you did, which is something that goes with you in this world and the next, as we shall see what was later in Kohelet, when we talk about the journey.
Rabbi.
1 minute, just 1 sec. The journey of the soul. We're going to talk about that later in Kohelet. Go ahead, Ruth. Shoot.
No, I don't know. I mean, I think that we've seen these themes before, and like I said, there's a lot of repetition. And what's the point of
the point of the repetition is that each time he's looking at a different angle. This particular angle he hasn't discussed yet. In other words, it's like a symphony where there's a fundamental theme to the symphony, but each time you reveal another aspect of it. Any symphony has a basic backbone that you keep going over in a different way. So there are fundamental themes here, but each time we're looking at, so for example, here we looked at the aspect we looked at the very important aspect of what do you actually take with you. Before we talked about the pitfalls of a person who pursues money and so on. Here, we're raising the question, when all is said and done, what do you actually take with you, which we haven't addressed before. So there's always a similarity, and then we add things.
Now, how many pages is Ecclesiastes? Is it a long book? Is it a short book?
It's not a long book. It's a very dense book. It's not a long book.
Like 100 pages?
I mean, it takes an hour to read in the synagogue.
Really? Okay, so is the style the same throughout the Ecclesiastes, or can you tell that it's written by one person, or is it written by?
Oh, it's definitely from one person. The style is the same throughout. And again, the style is that we take a central theme and we come back to it and we add to it. You know, it's like the unfolding of a flower, like the way a symphony develops and so on. So now we've added the recognition that not only is the pursuit of wealth for its own sake something vexing and dangerous and evil, the question becomes, what does a person actually leave this world with? And the next chapter is going to start with this theme that we left this chapter, which is the person who God has given much to, and we're now going to talk about the internal life of the greedy person. In other words, we're going to deal with the question of what's going on within this person and why this person is consistently unsatisfied and angry and so on. So that's the next step. So here we talked about the journey through life. Now we're going to focus in on the internal life that comes to someone whose life is driven by greed. But before we get there, there's a few notes. So Rashi makes the point that to carry away your portion means to say not just to bear your burden that you have to, but what do you take away, right? So you go into the next world, you leave this world naked as you came. So what do you carry with you? So what you carry with you was whatever Torah and mitzvot and good deeds you created with your life. You use your time for it. Or the Torah you caused others to study because you supported a Jewish day school, or the good deeds because you fed the poor and clothed them, and so on and so forth. So that's what you carry away. You never carry away anything you own. You carry away your good deeds. That's because that is currency in this world and the next. There's a story. This particular Rashi is expressed in a story that Magidim, that itinerant preachers used to tell. So the story is that there once was someone who dies, a very wealthy man who unfortunately was one of these people, as we said, who lived for his wealth and didn't share it very much. So he comes before the heavenly court, and the heavenly court asks him, what did you do with your life? He said, I made a lot of money. You study Torah? Not really. You give charity? Not really. But he says, to get into heaven, I need to give charity. Here, I happen to have stashed a checkbook in my shrouds, and I'll write you a check for $1 billion. It's good. Back down on earth. So the angel looks at the check and turns to him and says, my friend, here we don't take checks. We only take receipts. And that's the point. We only take charitable receipts, the good that you already did in this world. That's your portion that you carry with you. So Rashi emphasizes that the text is actually expressing this idea. And Rashi said, what's the joy? So if you look in 17, what does it mean? What does it mean, l'smoach b'amalo, to rejoice in his labor? So Rashi explains this means literally to rejoice in the good deeds that you can take with your labor. And by the same token, simchat libo, the rejoicing of your heart, means to say you caused other people to rejoice. In other words, you made sure that everyone had sufficient food and clothing and so on to enjoy the holidays, that you help people celebrate the Yom Tovim. As we know, Pesach has a lot of expenses, and we need, and our community has a fund for this purpose, and every Jewish community has a fund for this purpose. So this is all Rashi's approach, and the Targum is explicit that what does it mean to what does this mean that you gave tzedakah? Then you can receive you can receive a reward in the next world. And the Targum also makes an interesting point, that it says that you should remember the days of your life. In other words, when you come to the next world, you'll be reminded of the days of your life. How many did you waste, and how many did you use for good purposes? Because there's a limit to them, and we're required to use every day for some good purpose. Someone had a question. No, someone wanted to say something, I thought. Okay.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
So we have a tradition that Shlomo Melech created the laws of Eruv. Is there a connection in Koheles to that?
The reference is, rejoice, my son, because you are wise. I don't know if that is in Kohelet. It should be in, I believe it's mentioned in Tractate Eruvin, but the verse says, rejoice, my son, that you are wise, or something. It may be a Mishlei, but I don't off the top of my head know.
Rabbi,
Yes, Joe.
I have a question. Why the insistence that Shlomo HaMelech wrote it, or had to write it, or whatever? Because that's the traditional.
Well, the simple answer to that question is that this is the tradition that the men of the Great Assembly had received from their predecessors in the times of the First Temple, and before them. Frankly, it's a tradition. In other words, does it sound a little bit like Mishlei? Yes. How do we know Shlomo wrote Mishlei, other than it says these are the Proverbs of Shlomo? Who is Kohelet, the son of David? We say it's Shlomo. Basically, it's a tradition. I mean, one can argue that Mishlei, which has Shlomo's name in it, and Kohelet have many similarities. But honestly, Joe, it's because this is the tradition the men of the Great Assembly received when they canonized it, and they in turn received it from the scholars and prophets of the First Temple period, and so on. Remember, we're not talking a tremendous amount of years. If this was all canonized in the days of Ezra, which is probably in the the late threes, early 400 BCs. Remember, it goes backwards. And Shlomo is, we know, so
900.
if we use the standard dating, okay, so Shlomo is 480 years after the of Egypt, so that's 1312 minus 480, so it's about 900 or so. So we're talking from 900 BC to 400 BC. We're talking 500 years. It's not a huge amount of time, in the ancient world, and it's a transmission of 30 generations, whatever it is. So that's the tradition.
Rabbi, but those 500 years is very significant. It's a very long time. Ezra is already under the rule of Persia. The Greeks are already influential, and the language doesn't fit the language during Shlomo Melech. So a lot of
right, but the
people say that it had to be written
right.
during
So the
Ezra's time.
Right. So the question becomes, so there's a very strong tradition. It's written by Shlomo because the book of Ezra is written by Ezra, and Ezra's perfectly happy to say it's written by him. So, in other words, there's no pressing reason, because we could ascribe it to Jeremiah, who's only 100 years before. You know what I mean? There's no pressing. Eicha is ascribed to Yirmiyahu. There's no pressing reason to ascribe it to Shlomo. As far as language is concerned, the Kohelet is written differently from the book of Kings or the book of Yirmiyahu because it has a different purpose. In other words, here's the main issue. We don't have anything really to compare Kohelet to. In other words, you have wisdom literature written in the time of Ezra and later that sounds like Kohelet, but they may be imitating Kohelet rather than Kohelet imitating them. So none of those proofs are very strong. And in a vacuum, I'd say, maybe. But there's not a vacuum. We have a very strong tradition. Again, there's no pressing reason to ascribe it to Shlomo, because had we ascribed it to Ezra or Yechezkel or Malachi or any of those people who lived right at the time, they also would have made it into the Bible. It doesn't need to be ascribed to Shlomo to make it into the Bible. Therefore, the question is, why does this tradition exist? Since there's in other words, sometimes you want to make something very ancient in order that it be accepted, right? But we don't have that problem with the Bible because there's books written within 100 years of Ezra that made it their way into the Hebrew Bible. Therefore, the only logical reason why the sages said this is because they indeed had such a historical tradition. That's the strength of the argument for the traditional attribution of Kohelet, because there's no pressing reason to make up an earlier attribution, because much later books have been accepted into the canon. And as far as the language is a pretty unique kind of language that could have been written anytime. There's no doubt that later books imitated that language, but there's no solid proof that language doesn't come from earlier. All the words exist, all the roots exist already in early biblical Hebrew. There's very few new shrashim in Kohelet that you can find earlier. So that's the basic argument of the traditional approach, which of course I take.
So, Rabbi, at what time in Shlomo's life is he supposed to have written this?
So the Talmud says that he wrote Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, as a young man, Mishlei at the height of his rule, and Kohelet right before he died. He wasn't very old when he died, but he had been through a great deal. So
What is Kohelet known as in English?
What?
What is the word or the name of the book in English?
Is it
So
Ecclesiastes?
Kohelet means to gather together. Ecclesiastes means basically a gathering. So Kohelet means to gather together. And it means either Shlomo was speaking to a gathering of wise men, or it means these are the distilled gatherings of his final and most mature thought. Those are the two possibilities. But Kohelet is from the same as Kahal, as a congregation, as a gathering.
I was looking for an identification name like Song of Songs or Song of Songs. So
right,
what
so
is Kohelet
means
called?
basically a gathering of wisdom, a final gathering of his ultimate understanding. But Kohelet means to gather together. So the idea is that before Shlomo dies, this is what I gathered together. This is my sort of my final understanding of the world. Okay, Ruth, you had something. Ruth, you wanted to say?
Symposium. Other words could be symposium.
1 second, someone's speaking, but I don't hear you well. Who is this?
Can't you hear me?
Now I can hear you much better. Go ahead, Natalie.
Yeah, just mentioning another word for Kohelet. In Latin, we say symposium.
Yeah, but a symposium is where a bunch of different people speak. Here, Shlomo is letting all his experiences speak. It's like, it's a symposium, but of one person's multiple experiences.
Is it a monologue?
I'm sorry?
Is it a monologue?
I didn't get that. Do you want us
It's a
to just...
monologue.
Yeah.
The dialogue, yeah, but it's in a sense an internal dialogue. It's in a sense an internal dialogue. But that's a fair comment, yes. And so basically, Shlomo said, "I seen it all, and this is what I got." So now we're going to go to the internal life of the person. So we see what happens in the big picture. That either you gather good deeds with whatever wealth or power or skills God gave you, or you focus on yourself and you can end up with nothing, and you always end up with nothing if you only focus on yourself. So now we move to chapter 6. And it's very similar to what we said before, but there's a twist here. And what's the twist? So here we're going to say as follows, that we talked about someone who has children but has no wealth left to give them. But what if what happens what happens if one has nothing, no one to leave it to? So I saw another thing, and this is a heavy evil upon men. You have wealth and possessions and honor, and you're not missing anything at all. You're not missing anything. But God doesn't give you the ability to eat of it, but a stranger eats it. In other words, you have a person that devotes himself so much to acquiring wealth that, or so busy enjoying it that he doesn't, and let me be very clear here, very, very clear. There are all kinds of reasons why people might not marry, might not have children, but someone who does so only out of greed and hedonism. So no matter how much you acquire, what do you have to leave? Because you could have everything and you leave nothing, not good deeds, and not even to one's children many good deeds, because you never bothered to have those children. And that so that's the simple interpretation. Now, a little bit deeper, we can look at the Targum. So the Targum pretty much follows the plain meaning. However, Rashi goes real midrashic. Rashi quotes a medrash. It's very interesting that what happens. So he says this is really talking about Torah study. Someone has Osher Nechasim Kavod. You have wealth, property, and honor. So he says you have this. This is very far out midrashically, but very interesting to understand how the midrashim see things and how Rashi puts them together. It says you can have a person who has wealth, that's the written Torah, and you have nechasim, property, that is the Mishnah. In other words, the redaction of the laws. The kavod and honor, this is Agadah, because the Agadah is fascinating and instructive, and people enjoy it. So you have, but what don't you have? But you're not able to eat from it. You don't control it. So Rashi says, quoting the Midrash, this is the person who has all the knowledge, but didn't engage in Gemara. So Gemara, as you know, is the interpretation and analysis of the Mishnah. And it existed before the Gemara was written down. In other words, Rashi says, if you have a man who's wealthy in Torah, you know the scripture, and you know the rules, and you know all the Agadic Midrashim, but you don't have the process of Gemara. You don't understand how the laws are derived. You don't understand how to apply a law to a new situation. So you're not in control. So you're not in control. The stranger eats it. It means to say that you never really own your Torah if you can't explain where does the Torah come from. In other words, where do these laws come from? How did we derive them? How do we compare them to other situations? How do we apply them to new situations? And as far out as it seems, this actually is a very real idea, that when we don't understand the logic and the reasons and the background and the fundamental themes and ideas within our Judaism, we don't really own it. And we're not able to deal with new situations and new problems. So this is very midrashic. This is going far from the literal meaning, but it's a very important idea. And it's fascinating that our sages, saw this in Kohelet, that they were concerned about this, because they recognize that one does not really possess the Torah in an effective way if you can't understand where it's coming from, where it's going, and what its fundamental ideas are, so you can apply them to new situations that you didn't learn. If you can only parrot what you heard, then the moment a new situation comes up, or the moment there's a subtlety, if you don't understand the underlying ideas, you won't be able to make a distinguishment between one idea and the other. So at any rate, this is sort of out of left field, but a truly fascinating Rashi. And again, it's built on the Midrashim, and I think it's extremely important in the sense that to truly own your Torah knowledge and to own your Judaism, you have to understand its logic, its background, where things come from, how to apply them, what the fundamental idea of a law is, and so on. Yes, Ruth.
Well, I've said this before, and every time it's just so glaring, and I guess I kind of know the answer in a way. This is all addressed to men, obviously, and I guess women.
Who says?
Well, all these texts are addressed to men. I mean,
Well,
women are not included.
Women don't have wealth.
What?
There are no wealthy women in the Bible. There's tons of wealthy women. And
No, but you know what I'm talking about. It's like if a man beget 100 children, a man to
no,
whom
you
God
could be a.
is
Honestly,
every
Ruth,
man. I mean, every line is men.
so as I told you once before, all neutrals in the Bible are in the male form. In other words, you have to stop worrying about the language because when it says anything in the male form is either talking about a man or men and women. You have to ask, you're going completely from the wrong angle, in my opinion. You have to ask yourself, do these ideas apply to women too? And the answer is the pursuit of greed and wealth and so on, though more of a male problem. If you have plenty of greedy women out there and plenty of women who waste their lives with pursuing pleasure and or are miserly with their money and don't share it, and who are parsimonious with acquiring wisdom and live their Judaism without ever understanding it. I mean, in other words, the question you need to ask, all of us need to ask is, and why there's a goodly number of women joining us tonight, is whether these ideas apply to women or not. In other words, some things apply to men. In the biblical tradition, all the kings were men. So if I'm telling you about a story with a king, well, that's a man. Doesn't mean you can't learn from it as a woman.
It's the same reason why, and I said this before, that a woman cannot be included in minyan. I mean, it's the same.
No, it has absolutely no relationship whatsoever. And I have explained it in the past, and I'll explain it again. But now is not the time. The reason women aren't included in minyan is because women didn't screw up in the desert. That's why women are not included in minyan. The minyan is an atonement for the sin of the spies.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi.
Beverly.
I want to get back to
the text.
The Rashi that you just quoted.
Yes.
I think it's sort of an obligation. It gets to the issue of transmission of our tradition to the next generation, and how important it is not only for men, but for women to do Gemara study also, so that when we teach our children, we have, you want to have maximum amount of education so you can transmit.
I agree completely, which is why the understanding of the statements in the codes about women not studying Talmud is a statement as to the state of female education at certain points, rather than a fundamental negation. And indeed, at this point, anyone who can have knowledge needs to have it, because there are so few people who care about it. So you're absolutely correct, and the general and the
Rabbi.
Yes.
I have a question. What Masechet discusses Kohelet?
Oh, it's all over the place. Kohelet is quoted literally in every section of the Talmud that has a Gadah. I have a book here. I have a book that's not present. Zalmi, never mind. It stopped ringing.
I just wondered if you can quote a Mishnah that addresses.
I just want to say, Joe, that I have a book called Beis Aron in my library that has the Talmudic sources for every section of scripture. It's just not in front of me right now. Mishnahs tend not to quote, Joe, Mishnayot tend not to quote Kohelet, but Midrashim and Agada do.
I know, but Midrashim and Agada are part of a Gemara, and every Gemara has starts with a Mishnah.
Right, yeah. No, right. But you typically will not find Kohelet in a Mishnah because the Mishnayot, except for Pirkei Avot, right,
I know.
deal exclusively with laws, right? But the moment you get into the Gemara, you'll find many references to Kohelet. Indeed, this particular one, in this particular one, if I went down to if I went to the Beit Aron, I would find several pieces of Talmud that deal with it. I just don't have in front of me right now. But Rashi is definitely quoted a Talmudic saying. It's just not. This is not.
Are you saying?
I just don't have the reference in front of me right now. But it definitely is a Gemara.
Are you saying that in the Gemara, where let's say this is discussed, I mean, they cannot be divorced from the Mishnah that started the Agada even?
Yeah, right. But remember that we sometimes go very far afield very quickly, right? A lot of times Agada is there because.
I understand.
Right.
I thought it would be interesting just to see how a Mishnah.
Right. So the connection. Right. So the connection can be pretty tenuous, but I just don't have it in front of me right now, and I don't want to take the.
Next time.
Next time I'll bring the Beit Aron with me.
Okay.
And we'll take a look. I mean, I could even find it on my Otzer, but the Otzer only works with the laptop, and my laptop's on the blink right now. I'm talking to you from my tablet because I have to send my laptop away to be fixed. Okay.
So what was Ruth's question?
Ruth's question was, isn't this all about men? And my answer is, you follow the idea. You know the expression, follow the money? Follow the idea. If the ideas apply to women, if women are capable of being wealthy and greedy and stupid, if women are capable of being wise and discerning and understand the roots of things, and they're capable of giving charity, so then it applies to women too. That's all. Follow the ideas, not the tense, not the gender. Because in Hebrew, again, the neutral gender, if I'm talking about men and women, I use the male gender because there is no neutral. The male is neutral, but doesn't mean it's male.
No, that's true. So when we say Yeladim, we mean children, and it could be girls and boys.
Boys and girls together, right. If you have
however, today, because of the feminine movement, when they say Yeladim, then they say Yeladot.
Right, but technically, if you had an unruly kindergarten class in Israel and the teacher was trying to tell everyone to calm down, she would say Yeladim, and that includes the boys and the girls.
Yeah.
Now,
how do they say mankind? Mankind.
B'nei Adam, which is male, but it's neutral in the sense that it includes all men and all women. B'nei Adam, right, includes all men and all women. There's just no neutral in Hebrew. It's a grammatical thing, not a chauvinist thing. It's grammar.
Rabbi, I grew up in a feminist environment. I was raised by all women, radical feminist environment. I dismissed the Torah because of this argument. I dismissed the entire Torah. I didn't meet an observant Jew until I was 30 years old. So as much as I value feminism, I think it's very important to apply that lens to the Torah. You know, also, like, it deterred me from Torah study completely because I figured if it's not for women, it's not for me. Also, I have a question for you about the debate about the authorship. So this reminds me of the machlokas between the academics and the Hasidim about the Zohar Kodesh. The question is, was it?
By the way, it's not the academics and the Hasidim. It's the Mekubalim and non-Mekubalim. In other words, non-Mekubalim also question the authorship of the Zohar. Those who were Mekubalim and had received sections of the Zohar well before the Zohar was revealed understood that it's an ancient text. In other words, there are those who have a tradition, those who don't have a tradition. It goes much, much earlier. This argument was already taking place in the 14th century, not long after the Zohar was revealed. So yes, but the argument, the difference is that the argument of the authorship is between the academics since the early 19th century and the Jewish tradition. In other words, there's no real tradition that denies the relationship. Some people say that certain verses are written by others, but there's no Jewish tradition that denies the relationship of Shlomo to Kohelet until you get to to the modern era, as if it were. Now, and I wanted to say also, with regards to the whole male-female thing, that not only is in the book of Mishlei, which is also ascribes to Shlomo, wisdom is always feminine. Does that mean men are incapable of wisdom? Wisdom and knowledge is always feminine. Does that mean that men are incapable of wisdom? No. Certain things have a feminine and certain
But
a
this is
male
just a
thing.
word.
What?
Words can be feminine or masculine. I think one of the points is, that we should remember is that we should, when we read a very old text, we cannot read with the eyes that we have right now. For example, nowadays we have changed many texts, many ways of delivering a message because of feminism, because of many other things that have changed our point of view. But if I go and read an old text with the same eyes and the same point of view I have now, I'm going to get into a conflict that maybe it will I will not understand the message from this old text, for example. Even films, TV series that we watch from the 1990s, not a long time ago, 20 years or 25 years, and we see that it's so different. And so, yeah, I think one of the things we should have in mind is this. Otherwise, it's always going. That's why it's very important to understand: is it what's the goal of the message? What is who is aiming at, and so on.
And does it have a purpose? Does it teach us something? Forget about the particular details of the language. Is it teaching us something we need to hear?
Yeah, and that's why we need to understand the history and the situation of the time. That's time, not nowadays.
Okay, wait.
Very good, because the Torah speaks and the Tanakh speaks in the language of its time. I also want to say, so for example, Beverly's point that Rashi indicates that that an underlying meaning of the text isn't merely about wealth, but about spiritual wealth, about knowledge, and the importance of learning Gemara. In other words, the importance of taking apart the teachings of the Torah and understanding their meaning and their background and how to apply them. So even if it was written in the male sense, today women learn Gemara and should learn Gemara and so on. And we're going to get all hung up on this because it happens to be written in the male, and it may even be an activity that men did in the past more than women. It reaches a point of ridiculousness where you're throwing out all the babies with a little bit of bathwater, And again, language evolves. Natalie has a really good point.
Why don't we revise the language? I mean, revise the language.
1 second, Ruth. This is the Tanakh. This is the Bible. These are divine words. You don't touch them. The whole point of the Torah. No.
Rabbi, she's talking about translation.
Is that we never ever change it. That it's given to us by God and the divine inspiration.
But I feel excluded when I read this.
But you're talking about translation.
That is something you have to work on yourself. This is
Rabbi. What Shoshon is saying is.
But
Yeah,
let me-
he has a
Translation
point
question.
there.
So I'll use an example like Dr. Henry Abramson did a shiur on race in Tanakh, right? There's very little talk about race in the sense that we understand it. But he quoted Shir Hashirim says, "I am black but comely." And he said that's a mistranslation. That's how the Christians translate it, and that's how most of these Bibles we use translate. I'm black but comely. He says it can also mean black and comely, black and beautiful. And we just get these wrong translations from Christians a lot of the time. Not always Christians, but there are many ways to translate. There is gender neutral language, Ruth, that you can use. It doesn't need to be exclusive, and that's why feminism, is useful in my opinion.
Yes.
The translation.
Right.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
but
The
Shoshone,
translation could be better.
also, Natalie, just one moment.
Yeah.
But Shoshone, also, again, where the Tanakh uses exclusively feminine language for whatever reason, that doesn't exclude men, and vice versa. Yeah, Natalie, go ahead.
Right.
Go ahead, Natalie.
No, I
Natalie?
was just paying attention. Go on.
Yeah. No, anyways, I just want to say, so this question to change the Tanakh is ridiculous because if human beings can change it, it is worthless because then you don't really believe it's a divine text. The whole value of these texts is that they're divine. Otherwise, they're useless. So if I can change it because I don't believe it's divine, then it's a useless text in the first place, and we should erase it.
What do you mean it's divine? It's Solomon who wrote it. Where is it?
But it was so Solomon said a lot of things in his life. The premise
Divine
is that
inspired.
it was written Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration, with prophetic inspiration. The only books that make it into the Tanakh, into the Jewish Bible, are those written with divine inspiration. If they're not written as a divine message, if there's not a godly transhuman wisdom involved, they don't make it in. Shlomo probably said a lot of things that never made it into the Tanakh. Just like a book that we lost, the book of the Wars of the Lord, which is a Sefer Milchamot Hashem, which is in essence a secular history of the Jewish people and their conflicts and so on. We don't have that book, but that book is not a holy book. It's a book written by people without divine inspiration. It happens we lost it. But there's tons of stuff that Jeremiah said that were not prophecies, that Shlomo said that were not written with Ruach HaKodesh, that Ezra said. Whatever made it into the Tanakh by tradition is a divinely inspired work, or it doesn't make it in. It doesn't make it past the cutting room floor. That's why there are many contemporaneous books of wisdom that don't make it in, and the rabbis spoke about this in the Talmud. This is a key point to understand. Why? Because any human text, we saw just now, we had a whole debate about gender and how we look at women, how we look at the world. In other words, any book written 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago might be interesting, but the world's moved on. And it doesn't really give us how to live right now. In other words, Plato, who was considered the wisest man of his time, his politics and his values and his society and the way he looks at women or even people who are not part of the elite, you'd be, if you read Plato's Republic, you'd be pretty horrified with a lot of the things he says. We've moved on because it's human writing. The reason why the Tanakh, why the Bible has been relevant is because we start with the premise that it's all divinely inspired and therefore it's transcendent of time and place. And it's our job to dig and work and find what message it tells us that is relevant to us. That's a key point in the study of Tanakh. Otherwise, there's lots of good books to read. Why bother with this one? If it's
Rabbi,
a divine message, then I got to dig and figure it out.
Rabbi, the only comment I would make is
I'm listening.
the translation is not correct to say he was the wisest man. There is no such thing, the wisest man.
So what does it mean?
He was wise among the hundred thousands of very wise people.
Okay, that's fine.
Inspiration, I can understand. The inspiration was by the people that made the decision to include it in the canon.
Right, but Ezra, but Joe, the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, would not have included it if they didn't have some sense that it was a work of nevuah, a work of prophecy. That's the premise. And look, the truth is we did an introduction to the book, and this issue, by the way, that Ruth raised, that Joe raised, is an issue about the Tanakh as a whole. In other words, even the Torah portion we're reading this week, if you read it just by its plain translation, there's a lot of ideas in it that seem rather shocking. If you understand what it means, that an eye for an eye doesn't mean an eye for an eye, and so on, you arrive at a much more sophisticated understanding. Why would I dig deeper and insist on a deeper understanding? Because I say, since it's a divine work, it must speak to us in a deeper and more humane way, etc. Okay. Any other comments before we go for the night? We will pick up where we left off, and this was
That's
very
a good
important.
discussion.
It's very
have one
important to learn Hebrew.
Yeah.
So we
This
can
was a-
understand better the language and the culture as
Absolutely.
well.
No, but this
Yeah.
was a good discussion, an important one, because these issues that everyone raised tonight are issues that we're constantly looking at. By the way, I wanted to say one thing before we leave about language, that again, many statements in the Bible written in the male are in truth addressed to both men and women. Sometimes addressed to men, sometimes to women, but usually they're addressed to both. But when we speak, we need to be cognizant. And I'll give you an example from contemporary rabbinic literature, as if it were. If you look at pastoral letters written by great rabbis to their followers, to the Jewish people as a whole, an appeal for something, it usually says, Kol echad ve'echad, to all of you in the male, because that includes the female. But when we get to the 1950s, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who all those listening to me know is a very traditional kind of Jew, a very traditional Orthodox Jew, we all agreed on that, right? He switched the language. He started writing in all his pastoral letters that he writes to the Jewish people as a whole, like before a holiday or something, or an appeal for some mitzvah. What does he write? Kol echad v'echat, not kol echad v'echad, kol echad v'echat, the Rebbe always wrote. Joe, what's the distinction?
So male and female.
Right. So because we live in a world where people are concerned about this, where people are worried about this, where people are sensitive to this, he changed the language from the language of the pastoral letters that came before him, and always explicitly wrote male and female, because that is what makes people comfortable now. But you can't go back to a text from 2,000 years ago and demand that it speak in a way that wasn't an issue at the time, as Natalie pointed out.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you are also kind of saying that the rabbi made a change. It used to be
No, he
always said
absolutely
in the male, and he used both.
Right.
So
So
he made
now
a
let me
change.
ask you a question. When we have a letter from, let's say, his predecessor 6 generations earlier, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, when he wrote Kol Echad Ve'echad, was he excluding women, where it's like an appeal for tzedakah, for added piety?
No.
Care? He
No,
wasn't,
he didn't.
but that was the language. But because people are sensitive, and I'm writing it today, I need to write in a way that expresses their sensitivity. That's all. Yes, he made a change precisely because we live in a generation where women are much more empowered, and therefore it's the right thing to do, to make sure that they feel included, since there's a question and since it's something they're asking for.
I think that nowadays we are more aware of the importance of language, because language is very important in any kind of relationship. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship it is. Whatever, whichever situation we are in, and there are two people, language is crucial. So that's why it's very important. It is related to our unconsciousness, to our awareness, to identity, to so many different things. So that's why so many people are trying to adapt their way of
Language.
speaking, their language.
That's
And
very
yeah.
fair. And yes, changes happen all the time. And certainly, certainly happen. Beverly alluded to one. The high level Talmud study by women is a relatively new thing in the religious world, but it's happening at a rapid pace because it's something not that it wasn't existing before, but now it's become a matter of course, and that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
And by the same token, yes, we changed the way we speak precisely because people are concerned about language and want to feel included. But we don't go back and change the old text. The new texts, we make changes in it, as to Joe's point.
Yeah. Well, we can change the translation of them.
You can, as long as you don't go away
at
from
least
the actual
we can
meaning.
make notes. I translated a German text from the beginning of the 20th century, and I had to write so many notes. I had to make so many notes because otherwise the readers wouldn't understand the message. Everything was so much older than the language from nowadays, not even in German, but in Portuguese as well. So I had to explain so many things. So there was so many explanations and notes.
Yeah, and absolutely. And by the way,
and it was just the 20th century, the beginning,
right.
The middle of 20th century.
And before we go, let me share with you that Maimonides says about the Talmud, okay? Maimonides says that the Talmud is difficult to explain and understand because our language, even our Aramaic and Hebrew, has changed drastically. And sometimes we think we understand it and we don't. So language is a big deal. It's all great, all important. Everyone raised an important point, except that the goal is to understand the text as it speaks to us today. Changing the text sort of it takes away from the effort to truly understand it. If you have to break your head to understand it, that's better than changing it and missing the subtleties and nuances of what it's saying. Okay, everyone, have a great night. See you next week or whenever you join us next. All the best.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.